What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. This is the third part of the Gospel primer series within our larger primer series. The last two videos we did were on God's purposes, the election of love, and then God's solution, a story of Jesus and the Spirit. So hopefully before you watch this video, you'll watch those other ones first, because the order of these videos is quite intentional. The idea was that once we talk about God's good purposes and God's solution to an unspecified problem, because we don't want to define the problem quite yet, we'll be able to be in a position to understand what the problem really is that's been confronting humanity and been getting in the way of God's good purposes. So now we're actually properly positioned to do that. Okay, so here's a bit of a rough outline of what we're going to be talking about in terms of the problem. We're going to be talking about Adamic material, the flesh, sin, death, and then we're going to talk about the powers, and then sort of touch on briefly the question of the origin of evil, which tends to be asked in these sorts of discussions. And much of Romans 5 to 8 is also going to help us understand more clearly what we're actually being saved from, what God's solution is actually a solution to. As you know, salvation doesn't really make much sense unless there's a sort of situation out from which people are being rescued. So this is going to take us beyond the contingency of the sort of problem that we hinted at back in the first video in Ephesians. There's a lot of financial and sort of debt description there. And we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty now that we can, in the light of what God has done in Jesus, to talk about really what's gone so badly wrong. So a story of Adam. So we're going to talk about the flesh, sin, and death. And Paul has a lot to say in the middle chapters of Romans about this problem. His initial explanation of Adam occurs in chapter 5, verse 12, and then appears again in chapter 6. And then there's this sort of intensification in chapter 7. And then in chapter 8, we see the contrast between this story and God's Spirit. So in these chapters, Paul gives us the most detailed description of the problem with the human condition. But we're also going to find short summaries in other letters at different points that we'll reference. And the way that Paul seems to prefer to condense things is by using the term flesh, the Greek sarx, which we find spread through almost all of his epistles. So we learn from Paul that fleshly humanity is in the grip of sinful desires or lusts. And these desires and lusts take control of humanity's ability to actually do good things. And it's sort of pushing them away from living with God and one another in the way that God has intended us to live by God's Spirit. So as Paul says in Galatians, as I have up on the screen for you, for what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. So humanity doesn't really seem to have any power in and of itself to resist or break away from these negative desires. And this is going to clash with our kind of modern liberal sensibilities, which describe our humanness in terms of being able to work toward the good on our own. If we just come together and do good things, we can respond to all the bad stuff that's going on in the world. Paul's not so sure about that. His anthropology is much more negative, as we'll find out. So as Paul writes in Romans 7:18, for I know that nothing good dwells in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. So the problem that we're faced with interferes with any attempt to obediently respond to God's will, to obediently respond to the good. Now, when some Jewish people in Paul's day, some of Paul's Jewish contemporaries, and I want to be clear that Paul himself is also Jewish, especially Paul's opponents who show up in a lot of his letters, when they sensed a problem confronting them and humanity sort of more broadly, they tended to be quite optimistic about the way God's written instructions could help them. They were kind of like ancient liberals running around. They certainly viewed humanity's existence in Adam as dire, but it wasn't hopeless. But Paul, as I mentioned, wasn't that confident about all of this. And in fact, he says, well, part of the human mind might joyfully recognize God's instructions through the Torah, the law. People aren't actually going to carry them out. In the presence of these instructions, can actually create opportunities for humans to turn away from God. So this is coming from Romans 7, verses 11 through 13. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. It was sin working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. It may be helpful to think at this point about child behavior. Parents and school teachers, probably Sunday school volunteers, and those of us who can remember our childhoods quite clearly can probably relate to this concept on a deeper level. When a child is instructed specifically not to do something, what are they going to do? It's likely that they're going to do exactly the same thing that they've been prohibited from doing. And such a prohibition may also be something that they had not even thought of before. And similarly, I think for Paul, humanity's attempt to faithfully respond to God's instructions will actually lead to multiple wrongdoings. These attempts for Paul actually repeat the transgression of Adam in the garden over and over and over again. So Paul uses flesh or sarx language not so much to refer to something inherent in our goodness as God's creatures. He's not talking about the sort of stuff that we can touch, really, but to something unnatural and distorted that has actually taken hold of our humanity, our inherent goodness as God's creatures. But the problem is also much bigger than this. It's also a problem of death. So as we know, all living things decay and they ultimately die. And we're constantly declining toward that end at various speeds as much as we're trying to resist it. Paul narrates this situation in terms of Adam's story, suggesting that through Adam's transgression, quote, death spread to all. And so exercise dominion over humans. Paul even makes explicit the connection between the flesh and death when he writes in Romans 8:6 that to set the mind on the flesh is death, and to live according to the flesh, and that if you live according to the flesh, you will die. So Paul's emphasis on death in this story shows that it doesn't have a future in any sense. The flesh and death and sin necessarily result in extinction or termination. Adam dies, and so all of humanity dies as well. But we can learn even more about the problem from Paul, this really horrifying situation that seems to be affecting everyone as he discusses the topic of sin specifically. Paul now steps beyond his previous discussions of the flesh and death by dramatizing sin in a pretty shocking way. He describes it as a power, as sin with a capital S. Sin is fundamentally something that not only deceives us through the commandments, sort of like the flesh was doing, but it also enslaves and imprisons and wages war on people. So it's appropriate that Paul describes sin in just this way. So this is coming from Romans 7:14 and also 23. For we know that the law is spiritual, or the Torah is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I see in my members another Torah at war with the Torah of my mind, making me captive to the Torah of sin that dwells in my members. For Paul, sin is not primarily, and this is key to keep in mind, sin is not primarily an individual transgression or a mistake or a misstep or a bad decision. And it's not really an act of breaking some kind of a law. Rather, he views it as an evil force that has captured humanity. And this enslavement doesn't just affect human creatures. The entire cosmos, as Paul says in Romans 8:21, has been subjected to futility, and it's also in bondage to decay. So this is 8:20 to 21. It's a mistake on the slide. From Paul's vantage point in God's electing purposes shown forth in Christ's revelation, Paul now sees that the flesh and death and sin are all holding humanity captive in a situation that really does appear hopeless. Now, Paul will also occasionally reference the problem using another dimension. He'll talk about it in terms of evil rulers of this age, as he does in 1 Corinthians 2:6, cosmic powers, as he does in Ephesians 6:12, elemental spirits of the world in Galatians 4:3. And these sort of appear to collaborate with sin, death, and the flesh by waging war and enslaving humanity. And he refers to these powers as leader as Satan. I hope you appreciated my reference to Aladdin in the picture. Paul even blames these powers for crucifying Jesus in 1 Corinthians 2:8. Although I can sense some mythicists thinking that I'm kind of going in their direction. I'm not. You can probably make a video on Christ mythicism at some point. But for now, without getting into the nitty-gritty of Paul's cosmology, which would take forever, what we can say for sure is that the principal problem facing all of humanity, the entire cosmos, is that we're enslaved to the powers of sin, death, and the flesh. Our humanity has, in a sense, been invaded by evil in a way that prevents us from doing what God wants us to do and prevents us from living in full perfection and fellowship with God. And we can't actually get out of this situation using our own efforts. We don't have the capacity to do that on our own. And all of these nasty problems have gotten in the way of humans living in response to God's plan of fellowship. So you might be wondering at this point where all of this sort of evil stuff actually came from in the first place. And so it's gonna benefit us to take just a couple of minutes to outline and respond to a couple of the common approaches to this question. The first common way that people try to explain the origin of evil. Sorry, glasses are foggy. The first common way that people try to explain the origin of evil is by emphasizing what is often called free will. I'm sure that many of us have at some point heard or even made this kind of argument. Maybe you still do. It usually goes like this. When God created human beings, God created them with the capacity to choose between different sets of options. And in this case, between two different options. The freedom to choose following God, and hence the good, or following evil, and hence the bad. So evil is introduced into the world because humans, and originally the primeval humans, Adam and Eve, made the wrong choice. And in their freedom, they opted evil over good. God even created Satan and his legion with this capacity too. And they fell into darkness because they chose evil. And as the argument goes, it's much better for God to have created a world in which beings have the capacity to choose between good and bad than for God to have created just a bunch of robots who automatically do God's will. At least people have a choice in the matter, right? And this certainly resonates with modern people, especially those of us living in the United States, because we prioritize the value of unhindered individual decision making. The reason evil exists on this model is because people choose it. The second common way is really just the opposite. God directly determines all that goes on in the world, which means that in creating human beings, God created some to do the good, so they're the elect, and created some to do the bad, so they're the damned. The only choice involved is God's choice. So we're either in the good group or the bad group. And the existence of evil in the world is really the result of God's choosing certain beings to enact evil in the world, which would include Satan and his followers. And this really does clash with our modern sensibilities concerning freedom, but it does resonate with certain Christian groups who really want to maintain a strong account of God's immediate control over the world. But I'm sure you can sense a pretty big problem with both of these approaches. Both of them assume that the origin of evil is God. In the first case, God creates a world in a way that's actually really fragile. All we can really say is that it's a shame that we've been made in such a way that we can and do choose bad things and thereby introduce evil into the world. But God is still the one who built the possibility of evil into the very fabric of creation in the first place. Humans simply unleash it into the world when they make the wrong decision. In the second case, God chooses evil to exist in the world through a select group of humans who are, of course, destined for eternal damnation. In neither case can we say that creation is, in any sense of the word, good creation. It is either fundamentally fragile, containing the possibility of evil within it, or it is directly infused with evil's existence. At the end of the day, these positions call into question really the reality of God's unconditional love, an irrevocable commitment to us in Jesus that we talked about in the first video and also in the second video. God is either a fool for creating the world that can so easily fall apart when humans choose wrongly, or God is basically an evil entity who creates human beings to do evil. Either way, it would not make sense to trust this God. So where did evil come from? Part of the absurdness of evil and why it's hard to sort of pin down its origin is that it didn't really come from anywhere. Even more difficult for our present purposes of interpreting Paul is that he's not really that clear about these things. He's really struggling to grasp what's going on. So in Colossians 1:16, he seems to think that evil rulers and powers were actually originally created through Christ. And this could be read as supporting either the free will or the sort of determinist position, right? Where the powers choose to turn away from God and so fall into evil, or that God is determined that they would fall in just this way. However, these options really put us in a position of affirming some really awful stuff about God that really clash with what we know about God as revealed in Jesus. So we got to do something with this. And since Paul himself doesn't really specify concerning evil's origin, I think we have warrant to do the same thing. So instead of attributing a precise origin to evil, I think it makes a bit more sense to speak of it as a kind of absence. And Barth's going to be helpful here, Karl Barth, with his term Das Nichtige, which is essentially untranslatable in English, but it means something like notness or no-ness. And this is really difficult to wrap our minds around. And that's actually partly the point. The categories that we use to describe created things, good created things that are rational and ordered, simply don't work when we're talking about something non-created and chaotic, irrational, and unordered. The moment we try to apply words and phrases to evil that should be reserved for God's good creation, we're unwittingly giving it more power than it really deserves, and we're giving it more reality than it really deserves. So it would benefit us not to be too concerned, I think, about where it came from, because it didn't come from anywhere. We should be confident instead, when we get this sort of question, in saying, I don't know, doesn't seem like it came from anywhere, to the question of the origins of evil. I think this is a faithful Christian position. I think the more we're admitting, I don't know, as Christians, humbly, in the light of all this horrific stuff we're seeing playing out around us that is evil, I think the more honest we'll be about our theology. What really matters for us in our everyday life, what really matters for a Christianity that we can live with, is how evil is actually affecting humanity and the world now, regardless of the nature of its origin. We don't need to figure that out to figure out how to respond to it now. We learn from Paul, basically, that whatever evil is, it seems to be oppressing and enslaving and corrupting humanity and the cosmos now in a way that we can't break ourselves out of. But as we learned prior to this, Jesus does this for us. Jesus breaks us out of this enslaved and oppressed situation where we are able now to live in perfection and fellowship with God. Not completely. Not completely. We're still awaiting the ultimate consummation of that. But our thinking and our Christian behavior comes out of this reality that is more true and real than anything of Adam. So thank you for watching this third installment of our The Gospel series with a little help from Paul. I hope you enjoyed these videos. I think the next video that I'm going to make in our primer series, our broader primer series, is going to be on faith and faithfulness. What does faith mean for Christians? And then at some point soon, Laura and I are going to review the debate that happened today. I'm not sure when I'm going to release this video. It could be when you're watching this yesterday, the debate between William Lane Craig and Greg Boyd on penal substitution. I watched that debate live or at least in the way that it premiered on Unbelievable. And I have a lot of thoughts, and I know Laura does too. So hopefully our kind of commentary and review of that will be helpful for y'all. So thank you for tuning in. This has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With.